Welcome to part 5 of our live training session here with our LS Swap Nova. Now, at this point, we have calibrated everything within the Holley Terminator X except our cold start and taking a look at our warm-up enrichment and the after start. So these are things that we haven't touched on yet. We're also going to be taking a look at doing acceleration enrichment tuning, just off idle and also when we're driving. We're going to be breaking it down in a data log exactly what to look for so you can get your acceleration enrichment dialed in as well as your cold start. There's a lot of things to cover in this training tutorial. Let's jump in so we can check this out. Welcome back to our live training session here with our LS Swap Nova. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at working at our cranking fuel, our after start fuel, and our warm-up enrichment. Making sure when the engine is cold, as we're finding in the situation we're in right now, where we crank and fire over the engine, it's going to have appropriate amount of fuel so it fires off like stock, and then it's going to be coming up to operating temperature just like it would in the stock configuration where the air fuel is not too rich or too lean. Very specific things we need to take a look at, and we're going to be breaking that down here in the first portion of this tutorial. We're also going to be taking a look at our acceleration enrichment fuel tuning, which is where we actually blip the throttle and it adds a momentary burst of fuel in relation to the airflow as it entering the engine. We'll get into that later in the video, but we need to focus now on getting this engine to fire up and run. Let's go over a few things here before we jump in at actually firing up the engine and getting it going and taking a look at the process to actually tune if we need to make any adjustments to our cranking after start and warm-up enrichment. Now looking here on my screen, I have my volumetric efficiency table open. This is the table that we've been working with. We know at this point, this table has been calibrated for idle, part throttle, and wide open throttle. This is our base fuel table, meaning this is where the injector pulse width comes from. When we're on a warm engine, this will properly characterize the airflow as it's entering the engine and having the fuel in relation to that airflow. Now we know we have our VE table here, we have our target air fuel table here. When the actual VE table is estimating the proper amount of airflow, we'll hit this amount of target air fuel that we're requesting in our target air fuel table with the minimal amount of adjustment from that closed loop fuel correction. Again, we went over all this at this point. So we know that the base fuel table is going to be valid. We know that it's going to be accurate, meaning that on a warm engine, we'll find that the closed loop trim maybe has to adjust plus or minus 5%. That's an acceptable trim limits plus or minus 5% as the engine's running against the pulse width that's calculated from the base table. Now, a couple things with this. This is characterizing the engine's operation when the engine is warm. When the engine's cold, we have things change. We'll find that the fuel delivery needs to change in relation to this phenomena called a wall wetting effect. Wall wetting is when the fuel sprays out of the injector and it atomizes. Now on a warm engine it atomizes pretty well, and we'll find that it gets into the engine in a relatively straight shot. Some of that fuel gets absorbed and it puddles onto the intake valve or the intake track, but the majority of it will get into the engine. So the wall wetting effect when the engine is warm and the atomization is proper, and we'll find that the main fuel table here can characterize that. When the engine's cold, we're in a different situation. The fuel wants to stick to the intake track into the intake valve. It doesn't want to get into the engine as efficiently. And as a result, we're going to find that we have the problem where the engine will run poor, it actually run lean. If we try to fire up the engine with no compensations or corrections against our main fuel table here, the engine will actually be too lean. We'll find that it may fire up and die right away because it simply doesn't have enough fuel. We need to overcome the wall wetting effect and get the engine up to operating temperature. And that's where we use our after start fuel and our warm-up enrichment fuel to be able to get us up to operating temperature so that those can dissipate, and then we can ride just on our main fuel table as we already had tuned in our previous videos. Now we can't take a look at after start enrichment or our warm-up enrichment until we've actually tuned the main fuel table, because this is the basis for the pulse width, and the after start fuel and the warm-up fuel, those are going to be a multiplier against the base pulse width that's calculated from this VE table. So they're adding on top of what's coming from the table. So if we have an improperly or poorly tuned main VE table, we'll find that after start and warm-up enrichment, those can be skewed in terms of how much actual multiplication that we need through the pulse width and to get the fuel into the engine. We'll find that those could be all skewed and everything will be just thrown out of whack. We want to make sure that, again, you tune everything just as we followed along in the training tutorial here. You tune everything with a warm engine, then let the engine sit for at least overnight, and then come back in here, and then you can take a look at those modifiers. Those are modifier tables adding a percentage modifier against our actual, again, our base pulse width calculated from our VE table. Now, we have our after start fuel. That's the fuel that's added as soon as the engine fires off for the first 5, 10, 20 seconds. Then we also have our warm-up enrichment. That's the fuel that's added more of a long term after the after start's dissipated away, that might be added in for 2-3 minutes until the engine comes up to 160, 180 degrees, where we'll find that the atomization of the fuel spraying out of the injector is proper and that we can make all that dissipate away. We don't need any correction factors, and we'll ride just on our main fuel table. But we'll find that we actually have to crank over the engine and get the combustion process started, and that's where the cranking fuel comes into play. And we actually have another factor called a prime or pre-prime pulse fuel. The pre-prime actually primes up the engine before we actually start to crank it. Then we'll have our cranking fuel applied. That's what actually sprays the fuel as the engine is starting to crank over. Then it moves, after the engine's fired off, then it moves from the cranking fuel into the after start. After start applies itself, then it moves into the warm-up enrichment. So it kind of moves through a multiple step process to get the engine to crank, fire, run, and run at an appropriate air fuel. And that's where our interference here is going to be coming from, where we're actually going to be going in and starting to modify these tables out so that we get the desired result. We'll find that the values that Holley puts into their base files are reasonable starting points. That doesn't mean that that's going to be the end all of the values that you should run, and you definitely are going to be most likely need to go in and adjust those values. And we want to make sure as the engine's, again, firing off and running, we're finding that it cranks, it fires, it has a decent air fuel, it doesn't run too rich or too lean, comes up to operating temperature, and then everything is back to normal as we were just going through, and we know we've calibrated everything within the main fuel table on a warm engine. So this is kind of repeating the same process, going from start to kind of scratch again, firing it off, evaluating all the multipliers or these adders against the table, and then we can go back. Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.